Hey guys, this is Matt Core from CtrlPaint.com, and I want to just thank you for buying this series. You're helping the project to continue, and it's your support that makes it all possible. And this premium series is especially exciting for me because we're finishing off something that I've put a lot of work into, and that is the idea of making a grayscale rendering, which, let's face it, it's the foundation of all the painting you're ever going to do. So in this video, we are going to put all the pieces together and make an illustration. So let's pretend for a minute that you are an author, and you start out to write your next novel, and you spend the first, 300 pages, and all you do is describe the weather. And then after that, you introduce the protagonist and then, proceed in the way you'd expect. Well, my guess is the audience is probably not going to get 300 pages in. They're probably going to stop. And they're not stopping because you have bad grammar or because you don't use good word choices. Stylistically, you might have a lot going for you. But you've made the critical error, which is the structure of your piece just isn't really very smart. The reader's no longer interested because you haven't given them a nice plot to follow. So the point is, no matter how beautiful your prose is, the structure is very important. The way that you lay it out for the audience matters. And as a painter, you have the same deal. You have tools, which are your ability to render light and describe materials and all the things we've been talking about in the parts 1 through 3. But all of that hinges on what we call composition. This is like the glue or the blueprint, however you want to think about it, that holds together all of your technical abilities. And it is what gives the viewer a plot to follow. It is the story. So over the course of the series, what we are going to do is take this painting I made as an example. It is an example of a couple things. First, it is an example of just one workflow. I'm going to structure the videos in this series to follow essentially the way I treat most paintings. We'll start from a very rough sketch and follow all the way through to this finished rendering. But it's also going to focus on this idea of composition. At the big scale and the small scale, we're going to talk about various artistic choices that I'm making in order to make it a clear image. And remember, that's different from making it a realistic image. It's different from being able to be very, very accurate with my materials and my lighting. Those are separate. This is an artistic choice. This is me deciding where I want to put the characters, where I want the light set up. Really, it's a lot like being the director of your own little one-shot movie. So it starts out with a thumbnail, and thumbnail is the loosest, most sort of experimental part of the process. Next, we move to the rough phase, and this is where I add a little more information. I start thinking about lighting and local values, what types of materials might be here. This would be a nice time to get out reference material and really start solving those problems. And then it's time to sort of enlarge the image and start polishing. So the next phase is I will make a new canvas and I'll make nice line work. At this point, I also like to usually make paths. And if you watch the Edge Control series, you can learn a lot more about this. But this really just preps my canvas to be able to then make a very controlled painting. So once all that's set up, the next phase is the block in. And this is where I just put paint on the entire canvas. There's a couple different ways of doing this, and we'll look at two. But what this allows me to do is to just be ready to start polishing. So the next phase is the base render. I'm not thinking about special materials here. I'm just sort of giving a nice, cleaner treatment to everything in the image. You could really think of this as almost like a cleanup phase to get it ready for the nice polish that's going to follow. Once I'm done with this, I'm going to do a quick texture overlay. And this is to sort of cheat realism. I've done most of the work so far to make it look carefully rendered, but adding a little bit of photo texture on top, when used sparingly, can really take it up a notch. And then once you've done all these details and all the fine little brushwork, it's time to balance the image. And this is the final phase. The idea here is when I finish my rough, I had sort of solved problems and come to a nice statement. You could look at the rough and get what's going on. Even though there weren't any small details, it was clear. And to me, that's what painting is all about. It's getting clarity. We're not trying to impress anybody with how many perfectly rendered bricks we can make. We're trying to tell them a story. So this final phase here, I think of as final balancing. And what I'm doing is trying to bring my sort of detailed rendering back full circle to look like the rough. So a lot of times this means making certain areas lighter and other areas darker, or lowering detail or adding detail, whatever it is, such that I can sort of shrink down my large, polished rendering and sit it next to my rough and have them look pretty similar. Because it's easy to go off track. It's easy to have a rough and then start painting your large image and have it end up looking like a totally different painting. And that's not the idea. What we want is them to look pretty similar. So at a high level, that's all we're going to be doing. And over the next hour, we're going to go into much more detail in each of these phases. But before we do that, I want to spend the rest of this video talking about the idea of designing a value pattern, which is just a fancy way of saying laying out our composition, but thinking about it not in lines, but in tone. Because here I've made just a very, very simple example. It happens to be a 3D render, but I want to show you what happens with just making simple changes. Right now, it looks pretty boring, but think about this guy standing under the arch as a character. I know he's a rectangle, but just bear with me here. Right now, the only thing that stands out in the scene are these sort of very soft shadows. Well, if all I did was change the sky value, now the architecture, it becomes much more visible. But the character is still kind of hard to see, and there's really not a lot of visual interest. Okay, so now I will give it a strong sun. All I've done here is create some sort of dramatic cast shadows, and now the character becomes a little more visible. All right, so I'll step back. I will take the dramatic sun away for a second, and now I'm going to change the staging a little bit. So here I'm going to change the local value of the architecture and of the characters, and now they become a lot more clear. I bet you didn't even notice the first time around that there was a second character. So I'll flip it back for a sec. You can see in the very distance there's a little bit of a different value, and there is in fact a different character. So this is the danger of not making smart compositional choices. If what you need to do is tell a story that involves two characters, and because of the choices you make, only one of them is visible, well, that's your fault. That is not a photograph where he happened to be standing in a shadow. No, you're the director. It is up to you to decide on materials and types of light that'll emphasize whatever it is you want to emphasize. Because really what you're doing is you're making sort of a contrast puzzle, as in, I can see these two characters because they are a very light value and they are on a relatively darker background. And so the way I made them visually separate was to be just a different value than their surroundings. In the case of the previous example, I could knock out that first character by surrounding him with a dark cast shadow. But as you can see in the background, the second character is invisible with this lighting setup. So now we'll try another angle, and this time we've got the foreground silhouetted and the background is illuminated. And this gives you sort of a different storytelling example. Here the emphasis is on the character in the back, and the character in the foreground is more of a shadowy, mysterious figure. And I've achieved this by choosing both lighting, as in I only have lights in the background, but also in the local value of the materials. So here I've chosen what color to paint the walls and what color the floor should be in order to control the contrast. I knew I wanted the background character to stand out. I wanted essentially visual arrows pointing at him. And then I just made artistic choices to back that up. I could change the position of the light and make it more of a balanced scene. Now it's both characters being lit by the same light source, one in the foreground, one in the background, but now they're maybe addressing one another. Where in the previous example, maybe it was one character spying on another. Now you have two characters that are sort of an equal footing. And all I've changed here is where is the light. You know, you could change this and make it all a homogeneous local value. It's all white and have a very sort of angelic light source. And what previously felt like a sort of mysterious voyeuristic scene now becomes something totally different. And then the other choice that you can make, which I've not shown in these examples, is just move stuff. Remember, you are not taking photos. If what you need to do is make a character stand out from the background, why not put them in front of a doorway or something where it's a dark shape put there intentionally in order to pop them out? And this is why I sometimes think of it as a puzzle. Because what you have to do is say, okay, I have a light character, so that means if I want them to stand out, they need to have a dark background. Okay, easy. What if they're wearing a light shirt and dark jeans? Well, then it gets a little more complicated. So you have to have something that is both contrasty, dark behind their light shirt, but that's also light to contrast against their dark jeans. And for this, you have the ability to change the staging. You can put some potted plant behind them if you want to. It could be a cast shadow. It could be simply a rendering trick. You know, sometimes it's okay to just cheat the way you're rendering a form in order to make an edge a little bit more visible. But this is the game that we play. Clear images don't just happen accidentally. It's really up to you to make every tone count. Because sure, I agree, your image does need a potted plant. But if you're going to put it there anyway, why not make the tones enhance what you're trying to say, instead of sort of confusing the image? The important thing to remember is that the eye looks for contrast. So if you have high contrast, that's what your audience is going to look at. If you have low contrast, they might miss it completely. So use that to your advantage. Use it intentionally. Have a focal point, make sure the audience is going to look at it, and do that with tone. Because look, these examples are obviously not very beautiful. They are rectangles standing in a very simple diorama. But they each tell a very different story. So think what you could do with your own line art. These choices are a big deal. And so when you're moving from a thumbnail into a rough, this is what you're going to be deciding on. We are making a value pattern based on the staging. What kind of lights are we going to use? What kind of local values? So in the next video, I want to talk about how I arrive at my final rough and the various experiments that it went through along the way. Okay, we are going to start by talking about the least glamorous, least exciting part of this whole process, which is the thumbnail and then the rough. But in my opinion, this is also the most important part and is very easy to get impatient. So believe me when I say spending time here is going to save you time later. Because really my whole process is designed around sort of wasting time when it's cheap and then not wasting time when it's expensive. Because when you have a finished rendering like this, making a big scale change is a lot of time. That means you have to sort of erase a lot and then touch it up where you've changed it. It's a pain. But if you have something loose and messy and flat, changing something is easy because it doesn't need to look nice. Easier still, if you have a sketch pad and a pen, you can make a million changes or just throw it away and do 10 more drawings. So the process is sort of like a big funnel. You start really big and wide, and you'll see what works and what doesn't work, and then you'll hone it down further and further, and eventually you'll come to a finished rough. And after that point, you're sort of locked down. You're not going to be making big changes anymore because everything you're going to be doing is so time consuming. Rendering is slow. It just is. There's no way around it. So what you want to do is not render anything twice. And the way you avoid rendering something twice is by drawing two thumbnails and throwing one of them away. Again, make the mistake when it's cheap. Don't make the mistake when it's expensive. So let's see the final rough that I ended up with. Here it is. And it is probably a little more detailed than my average rough, but that's because this series was going to be important to kind of go through in a linear order and not do any backtracking. And really, the amount of clarity in your rough is totally up to you or your client. But let's examine what's going on in mine. The first thing you notice is there is a very visible character that is silhouetted against the middle ground and background. As sort of a storytelling element, you see him and you wonder what he's about to do. He's probably going to go driving off through the archway, and you know that because of some intentional choices I've made. You know that because he is looking in the direction of the arch. You know that because I've made some sort of visual arrows on the ground. These reflections in the water point all the way that he is going to drive. And in a certain way, you know it because it's the focal point. It is a high contrast, very geometric shape. It just screams attention. And I've gone through great lengths to make everything else have less contrast and to demand less attention. Another thing we have going for it is sort of an epic scene, which you know because it is an upward angle camera. You are either a worm on the ground or a very short character looking up at this heroic main character. We know this, of course, because we have all the verticals in our scene are converging towards a vanishing point. This is 3-point perspective. It's also a scene that I wanted to feel big, and in order to do that, I put in some scale elements. In the very foreground, you see a barrel, and we know roughly how big a barrel is compared to a character. Then in the middle ground, you see 2 doorways. Now, this is intentional. One doorway tells you something. That's a good start. But if you have 2 doorways on the same plane, you can tell, oh, well, I know they're the same height, and one's smaller than the other, so that must mean we're receding into space. Then you keep receding, and then you get to a really, really big doorway, also known as an arch, and by extension, we understand how tall the arch is. And the fact that there's rooftops that sort of continue up out of the frame, we know, wow, this place is really big, really tall, and it's sort of a dramatic landscape because of it. So creating this visual hierarchy was not an accident. It is how you sort of set the stage to give a very specific impression. But that is not where my sketch process started. I started with a sketchbook, and I was drawing just kind of interesting ideas. I had in my mind at first an idea that there was a big crowd chasing one character, and then he ends up in a dead end. And that was just one thumbnail that stood out amongst another page I had created of sort of flops. So I took that thumbnail, and then I created another page of just architecture, because in my mind, part of this scene was an interesting slum landscape. And that was almost like its own character. So I took this and I scanned it into the computer, and then I did some very quick tones. Now I spent a little longer on this thumbnail here in the center. But what this did was it gave me a more concrete idea of sort of the tone palette that I was going to be working with. No details, no fine rendering, just a quick sense of what this space is. And this would be where I would then begin to get reference and think about more specific details. But you can even see by this original thumbnail that I had a story happening. It was an angry crowd, almost like a Frankenstein scene, which are dark, and they're contrasting against the character who is light, and he is illuminated in a sort of a dark dead end. Now, as it happened, this was going to end up being too much roof and not enough ground level, because I still want to show off how you could use sort of different materials and different rendering techniques, and in a scene that's mostly roof, I just couldn't show off those things. But what I had established is a setting that I liked and sort of a general mood. Cool. Okay, so now the next step was I'll go back to the drawing board and I'll start thinking of a different camera angle. Because remember, this is all storytelling, so I have to sort of put myself as the director in this imaginary landscape. And then it becomes, well, what would be another way to shoot this scene? Before it was maybe like a helicopter shot. Well, now I'm going to do maybe a low angle. So for these sketches, I was really just thinking sort of spatially, what would be interesting from a storytelling standpoint. And pretty immediately, the arch became neat when seen from a sort of low angle and illuminated at the top. And then maybe as we sort of receded down towards street level, things would get a little darker. So in this way, we still get that cool verticality, but we're doing it from a low angle instead of a high angle. So at this point, I take the one successful, we'll call it a sort of thumbnail. It's still very messy at this point. It is a flat image. I'm not using Photoshop layers or anything. And I just enlarge it a bit. Because here I'm okay with sort of the broad strokes of my composition, but I want to start changing the specifics. Remember, we're going from broad to narrow. So my first step was, well, I need to bring back that character. This is sort of an empty scene. So I put in one character that had a light local value. Well, if I'm going to have a light local value stand out against a light wall, I've got a problem. So in this case, what I decided to go with was sort of receding into shadow as we get lower in elevation. So in this way, the white character stands off against the white wall just because of sort of a lighting trick. So next I hid the character and decided, okay, what do these shadows look like? Because it is essentially a blank wall with cool shadow patterns. So the shadows all of a sudden become an important design element. So I looked at photos of slums and I noticed that there was a lot of jumbled wiring. So what I wanted to do was imply that there's wiring out of the shot, as in there's wires somewhere overhead, and the only reason we know they're there is because they are casting shadows onto the architecture. And this is just an easy trick to make your scene feel bigger than it is, because if you can imagine the fact that there's wires somewhere beyond the frame, then you're imagining it is a large set. So that's good. Now I started to refine the ground a little bit. And remember, I wanted to point people visually towards the arch, as in I knew I was going to have a character and imply that they're going to be traveling somewhere. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll have some sort of reflections to be a light value to contrast against the dark, and I can use those as almost like arrows winding off into the distance. And then at this point, I realized that the original idea of the small character didn't really work for the good foreground. All I'd have would be a middle ground and a background, but what I needed was something more prominent in the foreground. So here I switched my character from being sort of a light clothing character to be a silhouetted, like a wanderer, a vagabond or something. And then I found myself in sort of a costuming problem, because right now I have a very specific silhouette of a character that might really fit better in a fantasy setting instead of a sci-fi setting. And what I wanted to have was sort of a lost in time, like maybe it was a slum that has fancy technology because it's on a far-off planet in the future, but it's still very run down. So with that in mind, it was time to swap out that character and just try different characters. And this is why experimenting at this stage is so much easier. Because if I wanted to put in a new character when my illustration was almost finished, this would be very time-consuming. But at this level, it was a little easier. Okay, so now we have two major changes happening. The other change is that I have shifted the arch. Now I have made it a little bit narrower in order to make this possible, but what I realized was when I only saw half of the arch, it was a bit of a missed opportunity, because geometric shapes have impact. If instead of having an arch, I had had a wall with a circle cut out of it, it would have been even more of an impact. But that's not really architecture that we see very often. So an arch is half of a circle with straight walls. This is a very strong shape, and as such, it really demands attention. But covering up half the arch was sort of throwing away this opportunity. So at this point I decided, well, okay, I need the arch shape. How can I get it back? So I recropped the image a little bit. I sort of pushed in tighter, and then I just shifted my architecture. And because we were working flat and things can be sloppy, this was a lot easier than if I had done it later in the process. And then finally, happy with the way the architecture is looking and happy with the overall value balance, I decided to play around a little more with the character. And the character I ended up on was Motorcycle Guy. Because I've seen enough of those action movies where you've got some cool motorcycle chase through the slum with, all the mud and all the jumping over boxes and stuff. So anyway, here we are. At this point, I feel confident that I have a nice sort of clear read. You can see the character, you know where he's going to go, and it's relatively simple from a value standpoint. And this is what I like. This is what I'm going to call the rough done. And from this point forward, we are just going to be clarifying this image and polishing. Okay, up to this point, I have been working very loose and sort of sloppy, and that was on purpose. It was a way for me to not worry about the details and just get the composition looking good. And at this point, I'm happy with it. So what I'm going to do is enlarge the composition. I'm going to have just more pixels to work with, and then I'm going to start making my sort of final lines. Between the line work and setting up paths, what this phase does is give me a very sort of nice foundation on which to make my painting. You can think of everything I've done up to this point as sort of a blueprint that's really just going to be reference for me, but this is actually the painting. I'm now starting working on the final. And so generally this is when I get serious about perspective. So for me, the way I like to get my perspective correct is to use guides generated by a piece of software called Carapace. Now this was made by the programmers over at Epic Software, and I think it only works for Windows, but this is just my personal preference. Now it's also worth noting you can use the vanishing point tool inside of Photoshop, and you can set up planes in essentially the same way. But really all we're getting here is a perspective grid. And once I have a grid, it's going to allow me to make my careful finished line work with just a little more accuracy. And the nice thing about Carapace is once I've got my perspective points set in the proper spots, I just hit Ctrl-C, copy, and then it gives me a 2D image that I can paste right into Photoshop. And it defaults to having sort of a white background, and I want the opposite, because all I want visible are these grid lines. So I invert that layer and then set it to something like linear dodge, which just means I'm going to have the lines visible and everything else hidden. And I'll sort of mask out what I don't need. And this will give me that nice roadmap. And for the rest of this process, is really nothing all that special. Here you could be doing this on paper with, pencils and a ruler. I just happen to be doing it in Photoshop. And all I'm doing is clarifying. Because what I did in the process up to this point is thinking more in terms of tone and shape, sort of large-scale graphic composition. But ultimately, this is a scene. It is set in a particular place, and so the details matter. So now when I get my pencil out, or in this case brush, I am actually deciding what are these objects. This would be a great time to start looking at specific photo reference for realistic details, and this is when you're just dressing out your scene. And as far as the technical side goes, I like to use a couple extra layers so I can control each line independently, and then when I like them, I'll flatten them down, because you really don't need more than one line art layer total. But for me, while I'm working, I just like to have what I call temp layers, just to kind of give me a little wiggle room. Now, another thing to notice here is I'm working at a very high zoom level. And what you're doing with zoom is you're sort of trading off the ability to be loose and flexible for the ability to be very, very specific and controlled. And it really, at this point in the process, I'm okay with being controlled. Because yes, you do give up a little bit of that dynamic quality, but the whole idea of working loose first is that I've kind of come up with my idea in a loose, dynamic way, and now I don't need to be dynamic anymore. Now I need to be clean and methodical. And with that in mind, zooming really far into my canvas and sort of getting tunnel vision is okay, because I've already made those sort of large-scale choices. Now I'm just doing cleanup. I'm sort of adding clarity at the small scale. And every artist treats line art differently. For me, line art does not need to look pretty. In fact, I very rarely even show my line drawing on the internet because I'm not a huge fan of mine. But for some artists, the pencil drawing is a thing of beauty. And for me, it doesn't need to be. I know that I'm going to paint over this entire thing, and you're not going to see any of these lines at the end of the day. So really all I'm doing is deciding where are my edges. Where does one object stop and the next one begin? Now for you, you might want to leave some of your line art in the final image. And in that case, the quality of the lines themselves is going to matter more. But for me, not such a big deal. This is just a blueprint that I'm going to completely erase by the end of the painting. And then once I'm totally done with the line art, the next part is just to give myself some paths. Now, if you don't use paths, I would recommend you consider it. This does use the pen tool. As you see here, I'm sort of tracing out vector shapes. But in series edge control, I talk a lot about why this is so powerful. But the short version is, if you make a path now that sort of outlines an important area in your composition, later down the road, you can hold down Control and click on the path, and you'll immediately have a selection. So when we are painting in the future and we want to, isolate one specific area of the canvas, this path palette becomes incredibly valuable. So really all I'm doing here is picking out the important shapes in my image, tracing them with vector shapes, and then, as you see, I'm building up a list of named path layers. And these live in their own palette, but it's important that they're named, so later when I want to, find the character, I can quickly find his path, Control click on it, and then I have a selection. It's one of those things where I'm spending maybe 45 minutes at the very beginning of the process, but it's going to save me a lot of time down the road. And for me, that is essentially a prepped canvas. I have nice line art on its own layer, and I also have a nice path palette that's all filled up with shapes that I'm able to reference later. At this point, I'm going to move on to the next phase, which is the block-in. Now, the block-in phase is pretty quick. Really, there is nothing special or fancy about this phase. All we're doing is saying, okay, we now have a large canvas, we have clean line work, but we don't have any paint. So it's really pretty straightforward. We're just taking the final result of the tones that we figured out in the rough process, and then we are, opening up our clean line work and just giving ourselves a base coat that now represents the new cleaned up composition. Really, it's just transferring small to big. And there's a variety of different ways to do this, and you are going to pick your own method, I'm sure. So I'll just talk about kind of two ways that I like to approach it. And the first way is just starting from scratch. There are definitely times when in the process of cleaning up your lines that you're going to end up with some different shapes. The notable thing here in mine is that my biker is a different pose than he was in my thumbnail. And the bike itself just has a lot more details. Another area that you really might need to do this for is if your perspective had a lot of problems, and then when you got your perspective grid out and you fix those problems, now your two images don't really line up. So for whatever reason, if you decide I need to start from scratch, what you need to do is just fill the canvas with paint. Now, how many layers you use, that's totally up to you. But for me, this is an awesome opportunity to use those paths. Because if I have the paths, I can Control click and immediately pull up selections, which just means that filling these areas with paint is very easy. Because really the hardest part about the block-in is your edges. It's making sure you have a clean separation between foreground and background, or character and environment, whatever it might be. And if you have a quick way to pull up those selections, it just makes the whole thing easier. So in the case of this painting, I'm really only going to have the character in its own totally separate group, and then I'm going to have the environment be pretty flat. And the reason I'm able to work that way is because I know I can pull those selections back up at any moment from my paths. Now, if you don't want to start from scratch, if you have a pretty similar rough compared to your final lines, the way you can actually do it is just to bring your smaller document into your final lines, stretch it out, enlarge it, make sure they pretty much line up, and then just start fixing the edges. So when you enlarge an image, it's going to get fuzzy, and maybe your image was sloppy to begin with. But really the only place that that's going to be evident are on the edges. So if you can clean up your edges and make them sharp, the rest of it will actually look kind of nice. Sometimes actually enlarging brushstrokes makes them look nice and painterly. So here you see really all I'm doing is cleaning up. And again, this is a nice opportunity to use my paths, because if I want to sharpen up an edge, it's nice to be able to select the object itself, paint inside it, and then invert the selection and paint in the background. And so in this way, even on a single layer, I can have a nice clean edge without having to work too carefully. Really, it's the paths that are doing all the work. So setting up those shapes in the first place is now saving me time. But really, this is all about just getting paint on the canvas and having clean edges. But once I've got all the canvas filled with paint and the tones generally match the tones in my rough, I'm going to move on to the next phase. This phase of the painting really provides me with a challenge for our video, because on one hand, I can say the base rendering phase is the longest part of the painting. In the entire duration of this process, it was probably half of the time I spent. But it is also very boring. This does not make for good TV, so I'm going to spare you. But in brief, I think of this phase as getting the primer on the car. Because if you wanted to paint a car, first you would need to sand it down so it's very beautiful and flat, and then you would spray on the primer, and only then would you be allowed to do the cool part, which is the actual painting. Now, the paint itself wouldn't take very long. Really, all the work is in the preparation, and really that's how the base render phase works for me. So here I've drawn just a couple little shapes, and we're going to pretend that this is the whole image, and I'm going to give you a quick example of what the process looks like, and then we're going to show the actual painting. And there's really a lot of different ways to describe what it is I'm doing, but the most simple would be to say we're going from a line drawing that has tone to a painting. And to me, the distinction is that a painting generally does not have lines. So whether you're erasing the lines on their own layer, or like I am here, just incorporating them into the flat painting itself, we are moving from lines to edges. I'm going to work on that transition from light to dark. If there are visible terminators, now is when I refine them. And I'm going to do everything short of actually putting in the surface texture. So any of that sort of small scale bumpiness is for a later phase. Right now, all I'm doing is sort of pretending these are the simplified materials. It's a very important phase because really this is when you add the realism to your drawing. This is when you have the most control over how light and form are represented, and it gives you a fantastic foundation that we are later going to put a little bit of photo detail on top of. But really, this is the bread and butter of your painting. Here's where we take all we learned about casting shadows, about the angle of the light, about relative value. All the things we've talked about in basic rendering are tested in this phase. This is where studying still lifes pays off. This big image is a still life. It's objects in space that are being illuminated by a light source. That's it. And so we do this over the entire painting. And it takes a really long time. But believe me, you do not want to take shortcuts. We are going to be doing photo overlay later, but it won't look good unless this underlying primer, if you will, looks nice. So here we are. We are using every bit of the canvas, and we are just refining edges and adding polish. This is exactly like what we did in Basic Rendering 1, except for one key difference. In Basic Rendering 1, we just had a single shape with a single material, so we didn't really need to think about value relationships. Here we have a much more complex scene, and we have a lot of different objects all sort of battling for our attention. So it might be hard to understand why I'm making each of these individual choices as you watch me work here, but it really is a little more simple than it looks, because my first strategy is get rid of the line work. Anywhere where there's a line eventually is going to be replaced by two values, and where those values meet will give the impression of an edge, not a line. So the question then becomes, how do I approach each of those edges? Because remember, the danger here is I don't want to have too much contrast. The more contrast I add in at this point, the more distracting the image becomes, and I want the clarity of that initial rough. So generally speaking, whenever I come to an edge and I want to get rid of the line work and make it turn into two values up next to each other, it's a question of how much contrast do I put in? A lot of times my block-in will leave me with lines that don't have any value change on either side. It's like one tone with a line or a couple lines describing a shape. So in that case, what I do is I just darken one side of the line a little bit and lighten the other side. So in this case, you can see visual separation, you can see plane change, but it's not adding too much contrast. Remember, when we zoom out, this is where we see our sort of composition-wide contrast. There's a big difference between the color of the background and the tone of the character. That's on purpose. We don't want to challenge that. So when we are refining, we are working at a much smaller value scale. I might push up 5% brighter or 5% darker, not 15 or 20%. And really that's this entire phase. It is going edge by edge, line by line, finding anywhere where there's a line in my image and turning it into two tones next to each other. And so as a result, you can see my lines are actually flattened right into my canvas. Because at this point, I'm not so worried about solving problems anymore. I'm not worried about the image really changing or shifting around. That's why we worked in the way we did up to this point. I kept it loose and layered and had the ability to make radical changes earlier on. But now we're sort of established. I have solved the problems, and so as I refine, it's actually not very dangerous to flatten my line work right into the canvas. When it comes to getting rid of those lines and replacing them with tones, it's actually kind of nice if your line work is flattened in. Because what that's saying is, I have committed. I am not gonna sort of try this and try that. I am totally on board with this design. I've gotten rid of my flexibility. Now it's time to just work it into the canvas. And from a technical standpoint, I find it's a little bit easier to get rid of lines when they are flattened right into your tones. You can mask away and sort of slowly hide the lines and then replace them with paint. But if it's all one layer, you will find that they integrate much more quickly. So in the same way that I talked about removing an edge by pushing up one side a little bit brighter and then the other side a little bit darker, that same sort of small scale value tweaking is how we're going to add details into the shadow areas in our composition. Because at this point, there's not a lot of detail going on in the foreground, but we really want to have some interest there. It can't look totally flat. So as I paint the bricks here, for instance, what you're seeing is a very slight push in the values, getting a little bit brighter, and it's allowing me to show some of the surface quality of that brick. Now, you don't want to go too heavy-handed with this. Remember, when you zoom out, you should not be able to see too much definition. This is really only something that you see on closer inspection. Because if you look at photos as reference, the areas of shadow really have very, very low contrast, and that's what we're going for. We're going to have some details, but to not push that local contrast too high. So no matter how hard we try, sometimes we just get contrast creep. And I've noticed that's happening here in the sort of white stucco area of my middle ground. So what I need to do is to lower the contrast. I want it to be more of a single tone of sort of brightly illuminated paint. And when I need to lower contrast, one of my favorite techniques is to just grab a big soft airbrush and paint with very low flow on top. So I'll just sample one of the values that I like, and then I'll just sort of soften it out. Here I'm almost just covering up all that high contrast that accidentally snuck its way in there. And the end result is sort of a flatter, less contrasty tone. I watch a lot of digital painting tutorials, and it seems like a common idea now is that speed is important. We are speed painters. We are rapidly prototyping concepts. Well, when it comes to this phase of a painting, I'd argue that what you want is being slow. You want to be methodical. You are carefully describing form and light and shadow, and that's not something you really want to rush. So in a minute, we're going to get to the final sort of texturing, polish, overlay phase, but I really just can't stress enough how important this part of the process is. Refining the form and the value relationships right now, making it look clean before you get detailed, is the best way that I found to make a really polished end result. So put on some good music, get in a comfortable state of mind, because you're just going to be at this for a while. This is one of those slow parts of the process that there's really no shortcutting. This is the phase that you might have been waiting for. This is where you trick your friends that you are a better painter than you actually are, and you're definitely going to trick the viewer into thinking it is more realistic than it actually is. But more than tricking people, this is just about being efficient. Remember, this is commercial work, and you probably have a deadline. So one approach would be to paint all these details by hand. And certainly if you're working on something that's very stylized, that might be your only option. But if what you need to do is paint realistically, photo details have a wonderful way of just pushing it up to that next level. And even though there's a lot I could describe about how the technical side works, really all we're doing is saying you have an underlying base matte surface rendering or glossy surface rendering, and then using a blending mode on a layer over top, we are going to just sort of overlay details. And the blending mode I'm going to use for all of these different layers is multiply. And what multiply does is it takes anything that's dark on your layer and it adds that onto the stuff below it. But anything that's light is essentially ignored. So knowing this, I assemble a sheet of details. And I do this based on like the reference I look at and also just kind of my personal history. I ask myself, what cool stuff would just set this scene? And with that question in hand, I go to the website cgtextures.com, which is an awesome free site, and I download appropriate images. Now the images don't start out the right values. What I need to do is collect a page of images, and then I need to use the levels command, or in this case also hue saturation, and they end up needing to look like this. So what you're seeing here is a base light value, and then on top of that are dark details. And remembering how multiplied layers work, what we're going to get here is it will ignore the background, and it will only add those dark details. So armed with this knowledge, we are ready to start overlaying details onto our image. So the process is pretty straightforward. I move one decal at a time from my trim sheet into my canvas. And then once it's in my canvas, I'm essentially using two different tools. The first one is free transform. Now this is where that nice grid overlay is going to be helpful, because it needs to match the perspective of the image. Nothing will kill your hard work faster than just slapping a flat overlay on top of your image and ignoring perspective. I see this all the time for beginners and it looks terrible. So remember, mind the perspective. Then once it is in place, you probably have too much of the detail, because really this is all about subtlety. You don't want to go too crazy with these details, otherwise it'll get noisy again. So I'm going to use layer masks to hide away and selectively reveal bits of the decal. So as you've heard me say a million times before, here I'm applying a layer mask to the layer, and then I'm painting with black and white to hide and reveal the image. These days, the way I like to do this generally is to hide everything, as in I make a layer mask, I fill it with black, and then it disappears. And then I'll get white out and begin to selectively reveal bits of that layer. And so this gives me total control. It makes sure I don't accidentally include too much, and really I only put those details where I want them. Now some of these things are super easy. It is a standalone item, and I've essentially given myself a spot for it in the image, and all I need to do is make sure it's the right shape, and I'll adjust the levels a little bit, and then it's in there. No problem. But some of them are going to take a little more work. Sometimes you're thinking of your trim sheet as more of a malleable raw material, not necessarily a finished result. So for instance, if I want to have cool dangling wires interspersed with conduit, but I didn't necessarily find that reference, I'm just going to work with what I've got. So the first thing I need to do is clean up this one chunk of pipes to be able to sort of repeat more cleanly. And then once I've cleaned that up, I can duplicate them and lay them next to each other, and it looks pretty realistic, good enough. And then in this case, I know I want to have sort of dangling bits that are curved down from the rest of the straight segments. And then again, no problem. In this case, I'll just cut a little chunk of it out, use the warp command, and then up in the left-hand corner of the warp command, there are these nice presets. And here I'm going to use the one called arch, and I'm going to give it a negative value. And then once I've got my pieces, I sort of connect them all back together, make myself a larger repeat unit, and then I start putting it in position. Now, if I had found a perfect photo of this sort of thing right on the internet, I would have been able to skip this step. But there's a lot of situations where you can envision a cool detail, but you can't find a photo. So that's where it takes some sort of Photoshop collage techniques to take what you do have, mess with it a little bit, and then you can have exactly what it is you're looking for. Okay, the motorcycle is a challenge, because a motorcycle is something that we've all seen before, and whether or not you know it, there are certain mechanical bits that are going to decide whether or not you believe this is real or fake. And I'm no motorcycle expert. So for me, the ability to use a photo and to just sort of slap it on top is actually the best way to approach this. So here I've prepared a few different cutout parts from internet photos, and I'm going to try and incorporate these into my image such that they sort of match the rest of the painting. And the best tool to do that is levels, because what I need to do is make sure the values match the values in my character. Because these photos were taken in the sun and my character's in the shadow, so I'm going to need to tweak it a little bit. But as you can see, this is just sort of an efficient use of photos. I targeted one specific area in the painting that is both important, as in it's a character that you're looking at, and it also is important to have very realistic details. And again, not being a motorcycle expert, for me it just made sense to go to the source, to just make photos work in my image. And since the perspective doesn't match, you can see that this takes some doing. And this is one of those cases where knowing how to do photo manipulation is really handy, because these techniques, they're not really painting. What you're watching me do here is collage, but in the grander scheme of things, it's helping my painting. So learning about how to use free transform and the warp tool is very worth your while to just sort of use photos selectively when you need them. And the final bit on this motorcycle is something I can paint, which are these wheel hubs, which are really just sort of cylinders. So for this, I will use a circular marquee, and I'm going to do a stroke, just really anything to get me a circular band of color. And then it's just a matter of using free transform to put it in the correct perspective, hide away what I don't need with a mask, and then just paint on top. But believe me, I don't like to rely on photos. This is not a way to do all of your painting. But for very specific cases, it's just the most efficient way to work. So I take this approach for the entire painting. I cover everything I want to with a little extra detail from photos. And as you can see here in the roof, sometimes it does require a little painting on top. You want to integrate these. It's pretty embarrassing when you have an obviously out-of-place photo sort of ruining your painting. What you're doing here is enhancing. You're not trying to show off. And then eventually you are finished with the photo texture phase. If you remember back in Basic Rendering 1, we got to a certain point late in the process and then realized there was an issue. Well, the fact is this is a common part of making an illustration. No matter how carefully you plan, something might just go off the rails. The important thing is being able to deal with it. So I look at the illustration at this point, and I'm just about ready to do the final balancing, and I look at it next to my rough and think, you know what? I kind of like the old pose better for the biker. it just seems a little more active, because when I went and did my clean lines, I actually changed the pose of the biker. I thought, well, maybe it would be more interesting if they were sort of pausing for a moment and sitting up. And now I realize I actually liked it better the first way. So I could start from scratch with the biker and go through the whole process over again. But I've got so many nice details in there, and all I really need to do is tweak the posture a little bit. So the way I like to do this sort of thing is to use the warp tool. Now, luckily, I've had the character as its own layer for this entire process, so they're a little easier to isolate. But then it's just a matter of sort of cutting out the character, dragging a marquee around them, and then using the warp command to just wiggle them into place. And the really awesome thing about this is I still retain all the detail, all the brush marks, all the cool stuff that I tried a long time to make is not lost. Sometimes this requires a little painting over the top to integrate it back, but the beauty is the warp tool allows you to keep your finished polish, but just shift it around a little bit. And really, this is just one example. The more important takeaway here is that you are not locked in stone, ever. Especially when working digital, it's never too late to change something. If you get a fresh eye on your project and realize something is amiss, don't ignore it. Because if your gut is telling you it could be better, then the audience is definitely going to see that. So anytime you have this feeling like, oh man, I wish I had fixed this, stop where you are and fix it. And the more that this happens and through experience, you're just going to get better at sort of the technical side of course correcting. There's really no one way to solve problems. Half of being an illustrator is just knowing that you're going to have to deal with problems as they come up and that you're probably not prepared for them. But don't worry about it. It's digital. Everything is malleable. So be tough and fix your mistakes. All right, now that we have the character in a pose that I like a little better, let's go ahead and do the final balancing. All right, we've made it to the end of the process, and this is very exciting, but it's also time to sort of take stock of where we are. Because what we did in the first half was come to a rough that we were happy with. If we could have just sort of stood far away from this thing and squinted at it, we'd call it finished. That was the image. But we do need to have a little more detail, a little more resolution. So the second half was trying to enlarge that while keeping it as close to our original vision as possible. Well, life happens. In the middle, you have a lot of opportunities to go off course. Now, sometimes some of those are going to be improvements, but let's just pretend for a minute that really we nailed it with the rough. We spent a long time on it, and we got to a place where that was what we wanted. So now our task is, how do we keep all the cool details and brushstrokes, but bring it back at sort of a high level to look like our rough? How do we get our value pattern reading like the clarity and the simplicity of the rough? Well, this is what I call final balancing. And to put it in really simple terms, what if we had, two areas of value, and the edge between them has a certain amount of contrast? Well, if I wanted to direct the viewer's eye to look at this, I would want that contrast to be higher. So I might cheat the rendering a little bit and actually slowly darken one value as it approaches the edge so that there's a little more pop, so that one stands out more than the other. Or alternatively, if I said I don't want the viewer to look at this edge very much, I want to de-emphasize it, well then I'd cheat the rendering in the opposite direction. I would raise the value such that they are closer to one another and have less contrast. And when you do this, if there's other parts of your image, all of a sudden this one is going to be less important, and the viewer is going to look wherever there's higher contrast. So this is our balancing act. Our image has a lot of different edges, and all of them are competing with one another. And then when we look at the rough, it's a little more simple. Because it doesn't have all those details for the eye to get excited about, it has sort of a clarity to it. I look at the two side by side, and I'm just going to decide what is the detail one missing. And one thing that immediately jumps out at me is this nice bright stripe of illuminated ground. In the rough, it really separates the ground plane from the wall, but it kind of got lost in my final image. So I just need to add in that extra brightness. And the way I choose to do it in this case is to use an adjustment layer with levels, and then to use a mask on that adjustment layer to limit where it's affecting. So it's really only affecting this little stripe of brightness. And you'll notice me flipping the canvas a lot while I do this. I have a keyboard shortcut that allows me to very quickly flip canvas horizontally. And what that does is just give me a quick, fresh read. Sometimes when you just look at something in one direction, you'll stop seeing the mistakes, but if you flip it, the mistakes will become apparent. Another one of the problems that tends to crop up in paintings is you get contrast creep, which is to say, too much local contrast, and it's distracting. Well, I have that problem in my shadow areas. In the rough, there's a nice sort of two-tone quality. There's the illuminated area, and there's the shadow, and it makes a nice graphic shape. But as I add all these details into my final, it gets a little more cluttered. So what I love to do is actually just use the airbrush tool, very, very big and low opacity, and just paint over top of all these details. I'm essentially averaging out and lowering the contrast to just reduce the emphasis. Because there's a lot of stuff to look at in this image, and I'm not erasing it completely, but I'm just sort of dulling it down. And it's amazing what a difference this makes. It might seem counterintuitive, I spent all that time putting in those details, why am I now taking it back? But really, it's just a balancing act. If If you have too many details everywhere in your image, your viewer doesn't have anywhere to rest. They don't know what's cool because everything is equally cool, and so it's just confusing. So in a sense, when I do this, I'm just deciding for them. You, viewer, don't look here. Look at the biker. He's the focal point. This stuff on the wall is interesting, it's set dressing, but it's not what you should be looking at right now. And the way I do that is with contrast. So really sometimes removing is just as important as adding. Now, another thing I worked on at this point is trying to make the foreground objects a little less flat, because really it's important that they stay silhouetted. But since we're seeing them at such a steep angle, it's actually a great opportunity to bring in that angle of incidence. And if you remember from Basic Rendering 3, this is where certain objects are more reflective when viewed at a steep angle. So things like bricks, as they bend around the corner, are going to catch a little more reflection than when they are in the deeper shadow. And I could apply this realistically to everything in the image if I wanted to, but I'm deciding to sort of selectively use it here to give a neat sort of graphic border to the foreground elements, just to give them a little bit of interest as they recede away from us without distracting too much from the rest of the image. And what I really love about doing this is that it engages the viewer, because when I indicate that there's a brick here or that there's a crack in the wall, but then you don't see any more details because they fade off into shadow, immediately your imagination is activated. You as the viewer understand this is all one surface, and I can see a little bit of detail here peeking out of the shadow. So I fill in the details. My brain imagines an entire wall filled with details, more rich than any painter could ever make. And come on, that's a wonderful efficiency, right? You, the painter, indicate that there's detail, you sort of hint at it, and then let the viewer do the work. This is great. It makes it more detailed to them than you could ever paint it, and for you, it's less work. So whenever possible, I really like to just sort of hint at detail instead of laying it all out there. So in looking at my thumbnail, I still see a little more sort of graphic separation between foreground and middle ground that I'm achieving in my final. It's a little more cluttered in the final version. So just like in our very basic examples at the beginning, what we want is visual separation. And there's a lot of different ways to achieve this. But for me right now, I'm feeling like this is an opportunity for thick atmosphere. Remember atmospheric perspective that we talked about in Basic Rendering 3? Well, here is a great chance. This is a slum, which means there's probably going to be pollution and dust and other particles floating around. Well, if there's particles in the air, there is going to be a natural dulling effect. As you look through these particles, the middle ground is just going to be lower contrast. So in painting in sort of a fog haze, it's an efficient way to enhance that visual separation. Now the background is dropped back a bit, and just putting in a few little light beams and floating dust motes is going to enhance the effect. Because what it also serves to do is give sort of a general softness to the atmosphere around the character, to play as a nice contrast against the hard edge of the motorcycle. And speaking of softness, the final step that I do here is actually to sort of isolate the middle ground, the biker and then the space in front of him. I want to keep this sharp. But then the background and the very foreground, I just blur them a little bit. Now we're not doing extreme depth of field like some photograph. It's just enough to control the viewer's eye. Because just like contrast, the viewer's eye is going to be attracted to things that are sharp and in focus. So if you have something that you don't want them immediately to look at, if you just soften it ever so slightly, it's going to help kind of keep their eye away from it, and instead keep their eye on the focal point. So at the very end of an image, I like to do a little bit of selective blurring and selective sharpening. Not very much, just enough to remind the viewer where they should be looking. But the point of all this is that we have now balanced the image. Through selectively de-emphasizing certain areas and emphasizing other areas, now it has a much more clear read. I think comparing the two side by side makes it pretty obvious. At the end of the detail overlay phase, it looked detailed, sure, but now it has more focus. It has more clarity and more intent. And really that's what we're doing. We are telling a story. So it's nice to be able to explain neat little details and cool special effects, but really all that is just dressing. What you're actually doing is telling a story. So if you can do that with less detail, good, go for it. But I'm happy to say that I have now achieved the intent of my rough, but realized in sort of a fully finished painting. And that's when a painting's done for me. I started with a thumbnail. That was the idea. I then clarified that idea by making a rough. And the rough was really where I figured out all the nitty-gritty problems and solved them with a value pattern that was clear. I let the sort of tonal distribution make the story evident. And then at that point, the ideas were all done. Then it was just execution. Now, in the process of doing the execution, it got a little off track, and that's normal. So then finally, I brought it back together with the final balancing to make the final image really remind us of the rough, and that's it. So when you make your own paintings, you don't have to mirror my process exactly. In fact, when I paint, I don't always paint in such a rigid way. But I think some of these key phases are worth reproducing, especially the idea of being careful and intentional about your rough. Spend as much time as you need getting to a nice solution. And then the final balancing. It's really easy to stop at the end of your sort of detail pass and to not give it that final tweak. But really this final tweaking and balancing that you do is what brings that clarity back to the image. And then what you're left with is something that's very clear and the audience just gets it. So congratulations on getting all the way through the basic rendering series. I hope you spend the time that you need to spend drawing boring stuff like still lifes and vases, but really it all builds up to this fun final image. And in the big picture, that's what you're going to spend most of your time doing. So study hard, learn the basics, focus on that foundation, and then you'll have years of, motorcycles and dragons and space marines. Have fun painting, guys. Thanks for coming to the site.